Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for another fascinating journey into the world of ideas?
Always.
Today we're diving into a paper that's, well, it's kind of a classic in cognitive science circles.
Oh, yeah, definitely a big one.
Even though it was published way back in 1991,
1991. Makes you realize how fast things move, huh?
it really does. The paper is called Whence Perceptual Meaning? A Cartography of Current Ideas by Francisco Varela. And it tackles this really fundamental question. How do our brains create meaning from the world around us? Like how do we actually make sense of all the sights, sounds, and sensations that bombard us every second?
It's a question that's occupied philosophers and scientists for centuries, really. And Varela's paper offers this really insightful roadmap for navigating different approaches to the problem.
I'll admit, when I first saw the publication date, I thought, okay, is this going to be relevant to, the cutting edge AI stuff we're all buzzing about these days? But let me tell you, folks, the ideas in this paper are surprisingly timely, especially with all the advances we've seen in AI recently. It's almost spooky how prescient some of Varela's insights are.
It speaks to the power of focusing on fundamental questions, I think. Even as technology changes, those core questions about how we understand and interact with the world, they remain essential.
Okay, so let's get into it. Where does Varela take us on this journey of understanding perceptual meaning?
Well, he starts us off kind of appropriately at the beginning, back in the 1940s and 50s with the rise of this exciting new field called cybernetics.
Cybernetics. Now that rings a bell. It has something to do with, like, systems and feedback loops, right?
You got it. Cybernetics was all about understanding how systems, whether they're biological or technological, process information and regulate themselves. It was a time of incredible intellectual ferment, with scientists from different fields like mathematics, engineering, biology, even psychology, all coming together to explore these ideas.
So kind of like a melting pot of disciplines?
Exactly. And it was this melting pot that led to some truly groundbreaking discoveries and insights.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, for one, cybernetics helped us understand the brain in a whole new way. Instead of seeing it as just a collection of individual parts, they started to view it as a complex, interconnected system governed by feedback loops. Kind of like a thermostat, constantly sensing the temperature and adjusting itself to maintain a stable state.
Oh, that's a great analogy. So our brains are like these super sophisticated thermostats constantly adjusting to the world around us.
In a way, yes. But it goes even deeper than that. Cybernetics also had a huge impact on the development of technology.
Really? How so?
Think about it. The very first computers were built during this era, and they were built based on these cybernetic principles. The idea was to create artificial systems that could mimic the brain's ability to process information and learn from feedback.
Wait, so you're saying my laptop owes its existence to these early cybernetics pioneers? That's mind-blowing.
It really is, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Cybernetics also gave birth to another incredibly important concept, system theory.
System theory. Okay, I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. System theory is this really powerful way of thinking about how complex systems, whether they're living organisms, ecosystems, social networks, or even machines, are made up of interconnected parts that interact in dynamic ways. It's about understanding how the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about analyzing individual components in isolation, but about seeing how they all work together to create something new and complex.
You got it. And this way of thinking has had a huge impact on a whole range of fields.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, obviously, it's had a huge impact on engineering, right? Designing airplanes, building bridges, creating all sorts of complex systems. But it's also influenced fields like ecology, where scientists use system theory to understand how ecosystems work and how they respond to change. And even in fields like family therapy, where therapists view families as systems with their own unique patterns of interaction and feedback.
Wow, so the ideas from this era really did have a far-reaching impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Varela points out that this cybernetics wave eventually faded, and a new approach took center stage, one that might be a little more familiar to our listeners.
Oh, you mean the idea that our brains are like computers?
Exactly. In the mid-1950s, cognitivism emerged as the dominant paradigm in cognitive science, and it really captured the imagination of researchers across disciplines.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in school. The brain as a computer, processing information, running programs. It's a pretty compelling metaphor, isn't it?
Oh, it definitely is. The idea is that, just like a computer, the brain operates on symbols and rules. It takes in information from the world, processes it according to these rules, and then produces outputs like thoughts, decisions, actions.
So, like, our minds are manipulating these mental symbols to make sense of the world around us. Did this idea lead to any attempts to build, actual computers that could think like us?
Absolutely. The rise of cognitivism coincided with the birth of artificial intelligence, or AI. And scientists were, well, they were pretty excited by the possibility of creating machines that could mimic human thought processes.
It was like, hey, if we can figure out the rules the brain uses, maybe we can program those rules into a computer and create a thinking machine.
Exactly. There was a sense of like, we're on the verge of cracking the code of intelligence. One really ambitious example was Japan's fifth generation program in the
Oh, a
1980s.
fifth generation program. Well, that sounds familiar.
It was a massive undertaking. The goal was to build a computer that could understand natural language, translate languages, even write its own programs. It was driven by this belief that using these cognitivist principles, we could create a truly thinking machine.
A computer writing its own programs sounds straight out of science fiction. What about research on real human brains? How did this computer metaphor influence how scientists studied the mind?
Well, it had a big impact on cognitive psychology for sure. Researchers started designing experiments to test how our minds represent the world using symbols.
Can you give us an example of one of these experiments?
Sure. One classic example is mental rotation. They would show people images of geometric figures and then ask them to mentally rotate those figures in their minds.
Oh, like imagine turning a cube around in your head.
Exactly. And the results of these experiments suggested that people were actually manipulating these mental images in a kind of mental space, just like we might manipulate images on a computer screen.
It's like our minds have this built-in graphics engine. So trippy to think about. What about neuroscientists? Were they getting in on the computer brain action too?
Oh, absolutely. Neuroscientists were starting to focus on individual neurons, seeing them as these tiny information processors that responded to specific features in the world, kind of like how a computer breaks down an image into pixels.
Each neuron is like a tiny little transistor processing its bit of information.
That was the idea. And they even started speculating about the existence of these hypothetical grandmother cells.
Grandmother cells. Okay, now you've got to explain that one. What are those?
Well, a grandmother cell would be a neuron that fires only in response to a very specific stimulus, like seeing your grandmother's face.
Hmm.
So, like, there's a neuron in your brain that's dedicated to recognizing your grandma and another one for recognizing a cat and so on.
Wow, that's kind of a wild idea. So if the brain is like a computer, each neuron would be like a little program running its specific task.
Hmm.
But didn't this approach run into some problems? I mean, our brains can do some pretty amazing things, like instantly recognizing a face in a crowd that even the most powerful computers still struggle with.
You're right, and that's where the computer metaphor started to show its limitations. For one thing, brains are incredibly fast and efficient, able to process complex information in a fraction of a second. This speed advantage suggested that maybe something more was going on than just step-by-step, rule-based processing like in a traditional computer program.
So if it's not just symbols and rules, what else could be happening? What's the alternative?
That's where the idea of emergence comes in.
Emergence. Okay, now you've got me hooked. What is that, and how does it help us understand something as complex as, well, us?
Well, emergence is this fascinating concept where
Okay, emergence. We ended part one with that. Now tell me, how does this idea of emergence explain something as complex as us?
well, it all starts with simple interactions. Imagine, imagine a flock of birds, flying in formation.
Oh, yeah. I've seen those amazing videos. Thousands of birds swirling and diving in perfect sync.
Exactly. Now, each bird is following pretty simple rules, like stay close to your neighbors or avoid obstacles. But when you have thousands of birds interacting like that, you get these incredibly intricate patterns of movement. It's like a living, breathing cloud.
Wow, yeah, it's mesmerizing to watch.
And that's a great example of emergence in action. These complex behaviors arise from the interaction of many simpler elements, even if those individual elements aren't that complex themselves.
Okay, so how does this flock of birds analogy apply to, our brains? Are you saying our thoughts and feelings are just the result of a bunch of neurons randomly firing? I don't know, it's kind of hard to imagine how something as complex as consciousness could emerge from, well, from just simple interactions like that.
It is mind-boggling, isn't it? But that's the beauty of emergence. It's not about randomness, but about how these simple interactions, when scaled up to billions of neurons, can give rise to incredibly complex and sophisticated behaviors.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So are you saying that, I don't know, are you saying that our brains are like giant ant colonies or something? I'm not sure that's a comforting thought.
Haha. No, not exactly like ant colonies, but I get your point. It is kind of a wild idea to think that something as complex as our minds could arise from, well, from what seems like such a simple starting point.
Yeah, it's definitely stretching my brain a bit,
Mhm.
but I see the analogy. Simple interactions, complex results. Did this shift towards emergence? Did it change how scientists approached artificial intelligence?
It did, big time. It led to this whole new approach called connectionism.
Connectionism. Okay, I've heard that term before, but I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Well, connectionism is all about building artificial neural networks. These networks are kind of like simplified models of the brain. They're made up of these interconnected units that work together, kind of like neurons do.
Oh yeah, neural networks. It seems like they're everywhere these days. Every time I read about a new AI breakthrough, it's powered by these things. But I've always been kind of fuzzy on like how they actually work. Can you break it down for me? Like explain it in a way that even I can understand.
Sure, I'll give it a shot. Imagine a network of nodes, kind of like a web, where each node is like a tiny little switch that can be on or off. And these nodes are connected by links, and each link has a certain weight,
Mm.
which determines how strong the connection is between those two nodes.
So kind of like, I don't know, kind of like how some friendships are stronger than others.
Exactly. Now, the really cool thing is that the network learns by adjusting the weights of these connections. And it does this based on the input it receives.
So like if you show a neural network a bunch of pictures of cats, it will eventually learn to recognize like the patterns in those images that are characteristic of cats.
You got it. The network is constantly fine-tuning its connections, making some stronger and others weaker based on the feedback it gets. It's kind of like how we learn. When you practice something over and over, you get better at it because your brain is literally rewiring itself, strengthening the connections between neurons that fire together. It's actually called Hebb's rule.
Whoa, that's amazing. So these networks are constantly learning and adapting just like our brains do.
Yeah, that's the idea. It's this constant process of feedback and adjustment.
Okay, so it's all about recognizing patterns and adjusting connections. But I still don't quite see how a bunch of nodes switching on and off can lead to something as complex as, I don't know, something like understanding language or writing poetry.
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Even with relatively simple networks, scientists were able to create systems that could do some pretty impressive things. One early example was this network called NetTalk.
NetTalk, what was that?
It was this network that actually learned to read English text aloud. It wasn't perfect, but after being trained on just a few pages of text, it could produce somewhat understandable speech. It was kind of a big deal at the time.
Wow, that's incredible. So even with a relatively simple model of the brain, you could start to get some pretty remarkable results. But I have a feeling there's more to this story. If cognitivism is about symbols and rules, and emergence is about networks, where do we go from there? What's the next step in this evolution of ideas?
Well, that brings us to Varela's most radical proposition. And this is where things get really interesting. He calls it inaction.
In action. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's so radical about this idea? What does it even mean?
Well, to understand inaction, you have to realize that both cognitivism and connectionism, despite their differences, still share this one fundamental assumption.
What assumption is that?
They both assume that there's a world out there, independent of us, and that our brains are basically trying to create a representation of that world, whether it's through symbols or networks.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, we experience the world, so our brains must be building some kind of internal model of it, right?
That's the classic view, and it's been incredibly influential in how we think about perception and cognition. But inaction says, hold on a second, what if that's not quite right?
Okay, now you've really got my attention. You're saying an action challenges this whole idea of our brains as like mirror images of the world.
Exactly. Inaction suggests that the world we experience isn't just out there passively waiting to be perceived. Instead, we actively participate in bringing it forth through our interactions with it.
Whoa. That's a pretty radical idea. Are you saying that we're not just passive observers, but active participants in creating our own reality? How is that even possible? It sounds almost, I don't know, it sounds almost mystical.
It's not about magic or anything like that. It's about recognizing that, we're not separate from the world we experience. We're part of it. We're constantly interacting with it, shaping it, and being shaped by it.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Can you give me a concrete example?
Sure. Think about color perception for a moment.
Color. Okay, how does that relate to an action?
Well, we tend to think of color as this objective property of objects. Like, a tomato is red, the sky is blue, right?
Yeah, that's how I've always thought about it.
But research shows that our experience of color is much more than just passively detecting wavelengths of light.
You mean like those optical illusions where the same color looks different depending on the background?
Exactly. Those illusions highlight how our brains are actively constructing our experience of color based on context, comparisons, and even our own expectations.
So it's not just about the physical properties of light, but about how our brains interpret that information.
Right. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Different species have evolved different ways of perceiving color.
Really?
Yeah. For instance, birds can see ultraviolet light, which is invisible to us. So their world of color is literally different from ours. They're experiencing a different reality, you could say.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. So you're saying color isn't just out there, it's something that emerges from the interaction between our brains and the world.
That's the essence of an action. It's not just about color either. Another great example is smell.
Smell. Okay, I'm listening.
We tend to think of smells as just, out there in the air, waiting to be sniffed. But studies have shown that our olfactory bulb, the part of the brain that processes smell, actually creates these dynamic patterns of activity that give rise to our experience of a particular scent.
It's like our brains are composing a symphony of neural activity to create the experience of a particular smell, not just passively recording it.
Exactly. It's an active process of construction, not just passive reception.
Okay, so if an action is right, and we're these active participants in creating our reality, what does that mean for how we think about, like, knowledge itself? Is there even such a thing as objective truth anymore?
Those are great questions, and they take us right to the heart of what makes inaction so radical and so relevant to understanding intelligence, whether it's our own or the kind we're trying to create in machines. But I think we might need to save that discussion for part 3.
All right, deep divers, we're back, ready to wrap up our exploration of inaction and perceptual meaning.
Absolutely. This is where things get really interesting, where we start to see how these ideas can change the way we think about knowledge itself.
I'm ready for my mind to be blown, so where do we start?
Well, let's go back to this idea of knowledge as a mirror, right?
Okay, the idea that our minds create this kind of map of the world and, the more accurate the map, the more knowledge we have.
Exactly. That's been the dominant view for centuries, really. And it makes a lot of sense on the surface, right?
Yeah, like the classic scientific ideal, trying to be this neutral observer, describe the world objectively, all that.
Right. But an action comes along and says, wait a minute. What if that's not the whole story? What if knowledge is not just about passively reflecting the world, but about actively shaping it?
Okay, yeah, that's where my brain starts to melt a little bit. It's like, how can we create our own reality? Isn't the world, just out there independent of us?
That's the question, isn't it? And an action suggests that it's not quite that simple. It says that the knower and the known, the subject and the object, they're not these separate entities. They're deeply intertwined, like two dancers, constantly influencing each other's movements.
Okay, so it's not just about having a mental map of the world, but about being in the world, interacting with it, and shaping it as it shapes us.
Exactly. Knowledge becomes more like a skill, like knowing how to ride a bike or play an instrument. It's a way of being in the world, not just a representation of it.
It reminds me of that line from Varela's paper, I think I even wrote it down, where he says, "To know is to evaluate through our living in a creative circularity."
Perfect quote. It captures the essence of an action so well. Knowledge is not just about having the right information, but about knowing how to act effectively in the world, based on our own embodied history of interactions. It's a kind of knowing how, not just knowing at.
So if we apply this idea of inaction to artificial intelligence, does that mean we need to rethink how we're building these systems?
Well, it certainly challenges the traditional approach to AI, which has often focused on creating these disembodied minds.
Yeah.
Like brains in boxes, essentially, manipulating symbols, learning patterns, but without any real connection to the physical world or the complexities of embodied experience.
So you're saying that, like, the way we've been trying to create AI, trying to build this brain in a box, might be fundamentally flawed. That if we want to create truly intelligent machines, we need to think more about how they interact with and learn from the world, more like we do.
That's a key takeaway from an action, yeah. And it's a perspective that's gaining a lot of traction in AI research these days. Instead of just focusing on building AI systems that can solve specific problems like playing chess or recognizing faces, there's this growing interest in creating AI that can learn and adapt in open-ended dynamic environments, more like living organisms do.
So AI that's more embodied, more situated in the world, more about skillful interaction than abstract reasoning.
Exactly. AI that can actually, be in the world, experience it, and learn from its interactions.
It makes me wonder, like, if our brains create meaning through this embodied interaction, as Varela suggests, what happens when we start interacting with AI that's also embodied? AI that can learn and grow and adapt alongside us. What kind of new understandings and possibilities might emerge from those interactions?
That's the big question, isn't it? And I don't think anyone really has the answer yet, but that's what makes this field so exciting. We're still just beginning to scratch the surface of what intelligence is and how it works, both in ourselves and in the machines we create.
It's like we're opening up this whole new frontier of possibilities.
Exactly. And who knows what we'll discover along the way.
Well, folks, this deep dive into Varela's work has certainly given us a lot to ponder.
I don't know about you, but my brain is definitely feeling a bit stretched right now. In a good way, though.
Me too. It's amazing how a paper published, over 3 decades ago can still feel so relevant and thought-provoking today.
It's a testament to the power of, well, to the power of focusing on these fundamental questions about how we understand the world and our place in it.
Absolutely. And for all you deep divers out there, I want to encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what we think we know about ourselves and the world around us. Who knows what mind-blowing insights we might uncover along the way?